In the past episode, we explored a bit of the Mongol Empire after the time of Genghis Khan, exploring such episodes as the reign of Gayuk and his death, to the reigns of several other individuals that followed it, included in which was the reign of Mongke, and the roles that his brothers would occupy in several of the territories in which they would be involved in. We had also explored some of the factors that had led to the success of the Mongol Empire, and some of the events that would unfold when they would meet other significant rivals or powers. Now we continue with the story of the Mongol Empire. The expansion under Ogedei would be some of the greatest history had ever seen and might ever see. Like some leaders before, Ogedei would be a leader skilled with the ability to adequately rely on the individuals that surrounded him, which gave him added strength. Amongst some of the individuals would be individuals like Subutai. Subutai would be a general who would be involved in activities under both Genghis and under Ogedei. His feats and successes would be extensive. A characteristic that he would do well in would be strategizing. His rise in the ranks and the reliance on him to lead and control were things that would represent some of the great attributes the Mongol Empire had. He would be quite young when he would be thrust into the middle of great responsibilities. A trusted individual of Genghis, and one that he would come to rely on greatly. His tactics on the battlefield would be known to cause panic and confusion in his enemies, and this would come into great showing against enemies even when they had clear advantages, like when the Mongols were facing the Jin. Great thought would also be placed into individual actions when facing opponents. Some of the battles he would be eventually known for would include battles like the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223 and the Battle of Mohi. At times, Subutai would also use his cunning and intelligence to significant effect. Other battles would see him greatly outnumbered but still weather overwhelming odds, like the battle against Muhammad II of the Khwarezmian Empire along the Irgiz River. Subutai would also be involved in the invasions of Jin China, being involved in several events and missions like the Great Raid in Shandong and the campaign against the Tongans. Under Ogedei, he'd once again be involved in the conflict with the Jin Empire, during which he would use more complex, well-thought-out strategies and intelligence to eke out important wins that furthered the expanse of the growing Mongol Empire. The campaign would see battles like the Battle of Sanfengshan, the Battle of Yehuling, and other conflicts. Subutai would also be involved in events at Kaifeng. Subutai would further be involved in the conquest of Rus. In the invasion of Central Europe, one attribute that would be of note would be Subutai's ability to gain knowledge on the terrain and characteristics of the territory he was facing. Significant battles during this time would include the Battle of Mohi 1241, where he'd be able to change where the Hungarians were focusing on in order to achieve his overall aim. The battle would also see the use of catapults, secret movements, and the use of the army in different places at the same time. Gunpowder weapons would also make their appearance in the fighting. The conflict against Hungary would also be significant for the conflict between Batu and Gayuk. Mongol activities in Hungary would have a massive effect on several aspects of life there. In addition to the service of Subutai's son Ogedei would also serve the Mongol Empire. Whilst in Western Asia, extensive activities would occur in Persia and in the region of Mesopotamia. Ogedei would be another individual who would gain military acclaim under the Mongol Empire. His story would be one of interest, rising to high heights but having started as an enemy soldier, a testament to the Khan's ability to rely on the skill and ability of those around him and to use the attributes of these people. He would be involved in the 1211 Jin invasion, occupying an important role. During his time, he'd often fight alongside Subutai. He'd be involved in a battle with Kuchlug, defeating Kuchlug several times. He'd prove his loyalty to the Khan several times as well. In the invasion of the Crimean Empire, he'd be able to face a large army and hold his own, eventually being dispatched by the Khan to give pursuit to the fleeing Shah. Makali was yet another individual who would prove himself several times, proving himself useful to the Khan and to the empire. He was son of a Jalair leader, and he would serve as Viceroy of China at one point in time. A capable leader whose uncle and fathers had given allegiance to Genghis. He'd served the Khan in several capacities before ultimately rising to the role of being someone that the Khan could rely on, a role that he would often be rewarded for in different ways, for example, being given command of territories. His life would see him involved in several battles, including the Battle of Yehuling, 1217 saw him attack Jin-controlled territory. His death would come in 1223, however his descendants would come to play several roles in the empire. Yet another impactful individual in the Mongol Empire would be Nagai. Nagai would be known within the Golden Horde, a general, and an important figure in its ranks, having massive influence in Europe while the Mongols were in the region. He'd be a great-grandson of Joshi, and well known to Berk Khan. He'd take part in the Mongol raid against Poland, and increasingly take up more responsibility as time went. At times he would be given several troops to lead. He'd further be involved in conflicts in Sandomierz, Krakow, and in other cities. In the civil war between the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate, he'd take charge of troops and become involved in several raids, passing through several regions and areas. He'd have to face Hulegu and Shiraman in these conflicts. The conflicts would see massive fights and clashes between large armies, but Nagai would often emerge victorious from battles that he'd come across. After Kublai Khan's reign as Great Khan began, Nagai would be active in several conflicts across Persia. 1266 would see interactions between him and the Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos, and an alliance formed between the Emperor and the Golden Horde. The previous year having seen an army of the Mongols cross the Danube and eventually encounter Byzantine forces on the battlefield. Nagai would further have extensive power and influence under Mengu Timur Khan, having some good amount of sway over the Ruthenians, the Ossetians, and several other people. Nagai would also be involved in the invasion of Hungary in 1285. A relatively weaker Hungary, however, he would meet several challenges during the conflicts. The conflicts would also see the involvement of Ladislaus IV of Hungary and would lead to many casualties for the Mongols. Political changes in 1287 would see Talabuga rise to the Khan of the Golden Horde and subsequently led to conflicts against the Ilkhanate, some of which would see attempts at capturing territory, attempts which would not be successful. Nagai and Talabuga would also be involved in conflicts in Circassia. However, his relationship with Talabuga would deteriorate, leading ultimately to the death of Talabuga and the rise of a new Khan of the Golden Horde in the form of Tokta, for which Nagai would be rewarded for his part in. But his relationship with the new Khan would not be without its own issues, and eventually the Battle of Nergi Plains would come about, which would see some extremely fierce fighting between the forces of Nagai and Tokta. At the end of this battle, Tokta would be the defeated party. At the Battle of Kagamlik, Tokta would return once again and face Nagai in another conflict, but in this battle he'd emerge victorious. Nagai would perish. Yet another individual of repute would be Bayan of the Barin. He would be a general who would fight under the Mongols, gaining success in several important and critical battles. His family had had a history of serving the Mongols, and he would be placed as commander of the Yuan army at some point by Kublai. He would also take part in several events and missions for the Mongols. For one, he'd be involved in the conquest of southern China, taking several cities and defeating several of the Song generals. During the campaign, the Mongols would win a substantial victory on the Yangtze. The conflicts would also see the involvement of Jia Sidao. At the time, Jie Doking was the Grand Empress Dowager and she acted as regent. She had been married to Emperor Lizong of Song, who had died in 1264, having reigned from 1224. During his reign, he would delegate a lot of issues of governance to those around him. He would oversee part of the conflicts of the Song Empire with the Mongols and would oversee several events. Jia Sidao, on the other hand, would be born in 1213. His sister would be a concubine of the Emperor Lizong, and he would act as chancellor in the Song dynasty. Some of the policies he would undertake would be unpopular amongst certain people. He died in 1275, but prior to that he had been punished as a result of some of his failures. Kublai, at some point in time in the conflicts with the Song, would send several emissaries who would be killed. Bayan would do the same, dispatching some emissaries to the Song court, but they would meet a similar fate, after which the Mongols would attack, leading to the fall of several areas and the defeat of several generals. Taizhou would fall to the Mongols, and some Song officials would appeal to Bayan with no success. Linan would eventually fall into the hands of Bayan in 1276, and surrender would be forced from the Song dynasty. These weren't the only people who gained acclaim under the Mongol Empire. The The story of the Mongol Empire is full of individuals and stories of people with unlikely pasts rising to take a role in the empire and elevating it forward to rise to even greater heights than it had reached before. Several events would also be significant during this period in the Mongol Empire, battles that were fought and won, and battles that would be noted in history for the events that had occurred at them, the strategies that were used, and the generals and individuals who were present. One significant battle would be the Battle of Mohi. Battle of Mohi. 1241 would see the important and critical Battle of Mohi take place. In it, individuals like Batu Khan, Shiban, Berk, and Subutai would make an impact on the Mongol side. On the other side would be individuals the likes of Bela IV of Hungary and Matthias Radit. Severe fighting between the troops would occur over the period of the conflicts, and the Mongol Empire would emerge with a victory from the major conflicts. The period prior to the conflicts would have seen Mongol conflicts with other armies and individuals like the army of Duke Henry II the Pious of Silesia, which had occurred at Legnica, the battle against the Transylvanian armies, and the conflicts against Denis Toma and his forces. Structures and barriers would be prepared in preparation for the Mongol advance, though this ultimately would be countered effectively by the Mongol forces, who once again showed their ability to react and adapt to the varying conditions they were placed in. Hungary had been facing its own internal political issues at the time. Unpopular changes made by King Bela had made him increasingly unpopular amongst certain parts of the population, and reversals of some of the policies that had been made by the previous king also added to this. Ultimately, riots would arise, and events arising from the riots would impact the strength of King Bela's forces. The Mongols had seen the Hungarians as a threat due to their interactions with groups like the Cumans. Conflicts would eventually begin. Several groups would attack the Mongols, amongst them a force that was under Duke Frederick, and forces under other individuals like Ugrin Ksak, who was the Archbishop of Kalecha. These conflicts would be met with varying outcomes. Some ended in victory against the Mongols, whilst others ended with the opposing armies that had met them receiving several casualties. The Mongols would retreat when King Bela eventually decided to attack ultimately. The Hungarian forces would give chase to the Mongol forces. At some point in time, the opposing forces would be warned of an impending attack by the Mongols. They would send forces to intercept Mongol forces at a bridge, which would catch the Mongol forces by surprise. Several casualties on the Mongol side would result. Some of the troops involved in the march to meet the Mongols at night would be under Kulumen, who was the king's brother and was the Duke of Slavonia. With the defeat, the Mongols would continue. Hungarians would have been left on the bridge, and they would be attacked by the Mongols. The Hungarians fled. Those at camp would be warned of the Mongols, and Kulumen would move with forces to meet the Mongols, but they would be overwhelmed by the great numbers. It wasn't just a small Mongol force making its way, but one a lot larger. Kulumen would hope that those in camp would be ready for the approaching Mongols, but they weren't, and battle would ensue. Initially, it went poorly for the Mongols, whose position would hinder them. Many casualties on the Mongol side would be endured. Subutai and the forces under him had been building a bridge to cross, and they would eventually arrive. The Hungarians would retreat to camp, and some Mongols would consider retreat. The Mongol attacks would, however, continue. The Hungarians contained within the camp would panic. Attacks by the Hungarians were attempted, but met little overall success. Eventually, the Hungarians would try to flee, but they would do so through the route desired for their retreat by the Mongols. Many casualties occurred on the Hungarian side. The result, a victory for the Mongols. Several events would occur after this, including attacks on other locations. King Bela had escaped from the battlefield and would be pursued by the Mongols. Back to the story of Ogedei. Under him as well, we'd see a change in the regional structure of the Mongol Empire as Karakorum became the empire's capital. Campaigns in China and against the Jin in particularly, as well as against the Goryeo dynasty, would bear fruit in some ways and lead to frustration in others. He'd eventually die in 1241. Torjin, widow of Ogedei, would be regent for a while, and under her some important conflicts for power would emerge. Gayuk would be the next Khan following Torjin's regency, and his reign would be marred in its own way by a conflict with relatives. Mongke would be the Khan from 1251 to 1259. He would oversee several important events and phases. Included in some of these phases were conflicts with the Southern Song dynasty. He'd be in charge when conflicts with the Abbasid Caliphate occurred, and saw the campaigns against the Vietnam, which were generally unsuccessful during his tenure in power. Though there would be other attempts after him, as there were in 1285 and in 1287. Under Mongke, the Mongols would be involved in conflicts with the Southern Song dynasty, and in the west. He would oversee several conflicts. Amongst them were the Siege of Baghdad in 1258, and campaigns in China. In the Siege of Baghdad, Mongols would arrive in a city that was the center of great innovation, wonders, and development. A home for great individuals of all types, from scientists to scholars and artists of all types, it would retain this position for decades. But it would also see several occupations, including those by the Buyids. Despite this, the population within it would swell. It would be founded in the 8th century, in a position that was favorable for many reasons and that served the dynasty that had started it, which was the Abbasids. Muhammad II of the Khwarezmian Empire would make an attempt at invasion, but it wouldn't be successful. In the period following the death of Prince Jalal al-Din, the Mongols would be active in northwestern Iran and in the Transcaucasus. Several cities would be captured as well during the period, which also saw the conflict between the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum and the Mongols, which would see the Mongols emerge victorious, and with the state becoming a client state of the Mongols. The conflict would also see the Battle of Ogedei. Mongke would have the assassins on his map, and he would eventually send Hulagu, who along the way would pass several regions like Transoxiana. He'd travel in the company of several troops, some Mongol princes and military engineers amongst several other people. Several Ismaili fortresses would fall to the general Kitbuka. Rukn al-Din Kursha would be successor to Ala al-Din Muhammad III after the latter's death, and he would be faced with the threat of the Mongols. The Mongols would move on to the Abbasids, who were facing their own internal troubles at the time. Several exchanges would occur between Hulagu and the Abbasid Caliph, and after several offenses and dismissals, Hulagu would consider the possibility of attacking Baghdad, a decision he would seek advice about. The eventual attack would occur across several fronts, and would see the construction of several structures in preparation. Messages were sent to those inside the walls. Several individuals would be wounded. The Caliph at some point in time would try to negotiate with the Mongols, but they would be determined in their course, eventually leading to the surrender of the Caliph. Thus ends this episode into the Mongol Empire after Genghis Khan, from Ogedei to Mongke. A period that would be characterized by several momentous conflicts, invasions, policy changes, and political intrigue. The Mongol Empire that was left by Genghis Khan was steadily expanding its borders, reaching into lands that it had not known before, encountering various peoples and leading to several monumental and impactful changes. The world would not be the same. Things had started to change and would continue to change. In the next video, we will look at events following the death of Mongke, from politics to conflicts, divisions, and expanding borders. Thank you for listening and watching this episode. If you enjoyed it, please take the time to subscribe to the channel. Also take the time to watch the other videos on this channel. Thank you.